Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining what is the last session of Outdoor Retailer. My name is Michael Sadowski. I'm really pleased to be moderating this panel discussion on how the Climate Action Corps members are reducing supply chain emissions. A couple of housekeeping items. You are all on mute. There's a Q&A box in your Zoom panel. We really would welcome and appreciate questions as we go through this, and we'll queue them up and take them at the end. It'll make for a much richer webinar, and we would love to hear what you're thinking. So please enter your questions and comments as we go through. So what we hope to do over the next 45 minutes is give you a behind-the-scenes look at how Climate Action Corps members are working to reduce their supply chain greenhouse gas emissions, scope 3. And we'll talk more about what that means. We've got an amazing group of panelists, and I will let each of them introduce themselves when we get to their piece, but I think we have a great mix of product types, layers in the supply chain, and so I'm really happy to hear from everyone and learn from them. So you'll hear from them individually. So we're going to be talking about supply chain emissions, and for Climate Action Corps members that may be in the process of measuring their greenhouse gas footprints, you're probably well aware of this, this graphic that lays out the different scopes of emissions. We're talking about scope 3 emissions and specifically purchased goods and services. It's a pretty wonky world that is greenhouse gas accounting, but just know that if you're a brand or a retailer, the vast majority of your greenhouse gas emissions sit within this category of purchased goods and services. So it's all of the emissions that go into making and moving products that you sell. Just to illustrate this, two examples you can see on the left-hand side, so Columbia Sportswear. So we'll hear from Joleen on the webinar about this, but over 90% of Columbia's corporate footprint in terms of emissions comes from the materials that they choose, how those materials are manufactured into products, and before that, how the materials are processed. And I would say that's probably the norm for most apparel and footwear companies, that over 80–90% of the emissions sit within the materials. And on the right-hand side, just for a different type of outdoor product, a compilation of emissions for a stainless steel water bottle. So here you can see that over 70% of the full footprint comes with the materials and how those materials are assembled into finished products. And so we know that supply chain emissions are really the biggest piece, and that's what we're going to talk about today. This schematic that you see is something that we put together for the guidebook that Corps members have access to. And it just kind of lays out where emissions are most relevant, depending on what type of company you are. So as I've mentioned, if you're a brand or a retailer, scope 3 emissions is going to be the biggest piece of your footprint. And that really sits within tiers 4 through 1. And so it goes from raw material extraction. So for example, if it's cotton farming, taking that cotton, spinning it into yarn, taking that yarn, knitting and weaving it into product, dyeing it, finishing it, and then putting it together into a final product. We have some core members that are manufacturers, and so for them, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions would actually be the energy it takes and resulting emissions from actually making products and materials. So again, this gets pretty wonky, and you can see plenty more about this in the guidebook, but just know that we're focused on scope 3 today. We're going to hear from our panelists about how they're approaching greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but know that we're thinking about 4 primary levers for reducing emissions. And so in no particular order, being more efficient with materials. So if you can make the same amount of product with fewer materials, then inherently you're actually reducing the resource load that goes into those products. Using lower greenhouse gas materials and processes. So we'll hear from Jenn at Burton and Rachel at prAna about how they're using more sustainable materials, things like recycled nylon, recycled polyester, bio-based materials. And so you can choose materials that are just lower impact. There's increased energy efficiency. So things like capturing waste heat, improving lighting, et cetera, in factories is a way to reduce emissions. And then lastly, deploying renewable energy. So a big piece of the footprint for many brands comes within the electricity and the thermal energy that's needed to actually make products. So deploying renewables across the supply chain is a really big lever. So as we hear from the panelists today, you'll hear examples that cut across these four levers. So I'm going to jump to the panelists, and Theresa, if you're on, I'll ask you to flip your camera on. And so what we're going to do is hear from each panelist about 7 minutes or so, just how they're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions reductions and some of the amazing projects that they're taking on to reduce emissions. So Theresa, I will pass it to you. So maybe quick intro, and then I will advance your slides.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Theresa. I'm the Global Distribution and Sustainability Manager at NEMO Equipment. And I'm here today to talk to you about an exciting new product in our 2021 line, the Chipper, which is a portable reclaimed foam seat. Next slide. So the idea for Chipper was born during the Switchback development cycle. Switchback is our award-winning closed cell foam sleeping pad that we produce with a factory partner in Korea. And at NEMO, our mission is to only bring products to market that create a better experience for adventure. And we were proud of the Switchback launch. The pad is thick, it's plush, and it has an industry-leading pack size from its unique nesting pattern. However, the Switchback production process has a waste problem. After feeding foam into the thermopress, each pad incurs lateral and vertical foam offcuts, which are also known as flashing. So in the picture on the right here, you can see orange flashing that's produced from just one day of production of Switchback. From here, these bags are destined for landfill or incineration. Next slide. So being at the factory and seeing this waste was a super visceral reality check for NEMO. Our goal with Switchback was to make a really innovative, cool product, and we were successful with that. But our commercial success had unintended consequences. So when we later began development for a new closed cell foam camp seat, solving the waste problem was a design requirement to move forward. Luckily, our factory wanted to collaborate with us too. So together, we identified a potential foam recycling partner. We gathered both Switchback and other pad flashing waste for feedstock trials. And about an hour up the road, the recycler loaded a big machine that's nicknamed the Chipper with our foam waste. The new foam stock was beautifully marbled, and it had some unexpected performance wins. The unique mix of different foam densities made for a thick and comfy camp seat. Meanwhile, we improved the yield of the material we had already purchased while removing good product from the factory's waste stream. Next slide. So it took us about 18 months to nail down the reclaimed foam stock mix and to figure out the new production process, but we successfully launched Chipper in January. So in 2021, we'll be removing 8.8 tons of scrap foam from the waste stream, and we will also be avoiding CO2 emissions by switching to reclaimed foam instead of using virgin foam for this camp seat. Next slide. So this is a photo of our product development manager and Chipper champion, Spar, with our team in Korea. And the Chipper program has already been such a success that the factory owner is investigating expanding his operation to process reclaimed foam on site. And at NEMO, we think that this is what progress really looks like. It was messy, it took a long time, and you're going to stub your toes in the design process, but we think that it's well worth it. Next slide. It would have been easiest just to toss out our waste, but this project led to an exciting, commercially viable new product that reduced our waste and our carbon impact. We think that it's going to take many more projects like this to hit our climate action core goals, but we believe that with design innovation and supply chain collaboration that we can get there. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Theresa. Listening to that, I know that I have questions. So if participants have questions, please put them in the Q&A. and we can bring them back to Theresa at the end. But amazing work, Theresa, and looking forward to talking more about this. So Rachel.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Theresa. That was super inspiring to see the work that you guys are doing over there at NEMO. So hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Lincoln. I'm the Director of Sustainability at prAna, and I'm here to talk to you about how prAna is looking at reducing our greenhouse gas emissions over the next few years and what we've been doing historically to try to compensate for the fact that we're making new products all the time. So our brand position is around clothing for positive change. And really there's three big pillars that ladder up to that. The first one is adventure for all. There's the one that I work in all day, every day, which is respect and responsibility, which we'll talk about today. And the last is progress, not perfection. And I love sharing these because I think it gives us that opportunity to continue to try things with progress, not perfection, but know that the bar keeps getting raised and we just have to keep going towards it. So I think that that's a great platform to start with. Next slide. Ultimately, prAna has always stood for sustainability since our inception, and we'll talk about some of the things we've done and where we're going in a bit. But ultimately, we focus primarily on the materials to make our products, the people everywhere who make them, and the purpose to run our business globally. Ultimately, we are looking at materials to be the biggest impact, as you've seen in some of the slides already, and Joleen will talk a little bit about how our family brands are looking at greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So here's a quick blurb of what we've done to date. So the last 20 years have been just a huge growth opportunity for prAna. We've started using preferred fibers back in 2004. We converted all of our cotton to organic cotton as of 2018. We have stopped using rayon from ancient and endangered forests. We only use preferred rayon and modal and lyocell since 2015. So we've done a lot in this material space, and now we're looking to kind of use our partnership with the Climate Action Corps to really quantify that emission reduction. Next slide. So where are we going? This is a quick glance at a few goals that we have for the next 10 years. And the one that is the most important today to talk about is this 2025 goal of 100% materials are using preferred fibers. I'm actually going to share our preferred fibers list today, and it's really exciting that we're driving towards this change. And we're also driving towards a 30% overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions by 2030. So those are the two ones that we'll be talking about today. Next slide. So where are we at? As I mentioned, we have this huge goal to get 100% of our materials be preferred fibers by 25. Well, we're already using 100% organic cotton, and we can quantify how that is helping the environment. We also only use man-made cellulose fibers from Tencel. 100% of our down is RDS certified, and we're currently tracking at 62% of our styles using synthetic fibers are recycled content. So we're in a really good place to reach this goal. Next slide. So our preferred fibers list is pretty robust. It actually contains 4 different lists, and these are the toolkits that our design and development teams use every single day to determine how to make the most sustainable products according to prAna. So the list that we're going to look at today is the preferred fibers list, but by no means is that the only thing we're using. We also have an avoid list, which is products that may not have a sustainable solution yet, but we are looking for and actively searching and piloting new options in this space. We have a do not use list, which is the absolute do not touch, do not pass go. And then lastly is the under review, which is new technologies or new finishes that our design team is interested in using. And we do a thorough LCA and biodiversity review on these products to make sure that there's something that would fit within our lists. They follow the basic principles that recycled is better than organic, that organic is better than synthetic, and that individual blends or individual fibers are better than blends for recycling purposes. So this is our preferred fiber list. You can see that it's separated by fiber type, which allows the design team to truly identify how could they improve their style out of the conventional yarns that typically they would go for. Next slide. So using that list and working with the Climate Action Corps to really identify our Scope 3 emissions, we actually have decided to involve academia because we realize that we're a small team and we can't do it all ourselves. So we're working with a student consult cohort over at UMich, and they are working to quantify the carbon footprint of our materials and how changing to 100% preferred materials will actually improve our overall carbon emissions and try to reduce them. So we're super excited about this team. And we're really happy to be able to work with such brains like the team over at Climate Action Corps and have the tools that they provide to get us on this track. So thank you.
Awesome. And that's the program I went to, Rachel. So I'm glad you're working with Michigan students. So go blue. Joleen is going to speak to Columbia's work in the supply chain, specifically tier 1 and tier 2. So kind of passing it within the family to Joleen.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thanks, Rachel. We are in the same family, so I will share a little bit more about that. I'm just going to, my name is Joleen, and I work for Columbia Sportswear Company as a sustainable manufacturing manager. And what that really is I look at managing the environmental sustainability impacts in our supply chains, really tier scope 3 indirect emissions. So next slide. And as I mentioned, we are a family of brands, prAna being one of them. So really great working with Rachel on rolling out these climate targets to all of our supply chain, including prAna's as well. So next slide. So just to start, I wanted to share a little bit more about the actions that Columbia is taking for climate change. As we know, climate change is a very large issue, and there's a lot of different ways to tackle it, different scopes. But I will just say at a high level, we really believe in outdoor industry engagement. So, engagement and collaboration, super important. A lot of us brands share the same factories. It's important for us as brands to streamline this approach, and also to share knowledge. So that's why we joined the Climate Action Corps through OIA. We partnered with Patagonia on challenging the rollback of the US Clean Power Plan and signed the Arctic Shipping Corporate Pledge. And then with measuring and reducing our corporate footprint, we're really in alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement guidance, and we've taken that into consideration as we've rolled out these requirements to our factories. For our materials strategy, I think Rachel shared a little bit more about the material strategy that prAna is using. And of course, we pull in lots of the information from there, and we share a lot of that knowledge. We will share that we are working on developing a strategy to incorporate more preferred attributes and sustainable materials into our products. And of course, manufacturing climate targets, which we've rolled out last year, and I want to share a little bit more about. So next slide. So as Michael shared in that pie chart, this is just a breakdown of Columbia's global carbon footprint. This is from our corporate responsibility report, which we published last year. And it was the second time we published our global carbon footprint. So you'll see tier 1 and tier 2 is what I'm looking at. It's around 21% of our total emissions. And of course, tier 3 and tier 4 is going to be addressed through a separate strategy going forward. So that's just to help frame the impacts. And then I did want to just assert that, alignment with the industry, again, is so important. I just pulled in, some of the key Climate Action Corps signatories. We're not limited to these brands. Of course, we work with a lot of different brands just to share that knowledge. We're in the same space with many of them, but we do pull in information and exchange ideas, especially around this strategy that we developed to roll out with our vendors. We worked a lot with these different stakeholders and brands just to get a reality check and feedback about the feasibility of this. And of course, as I mentioned, we did align our requirements with intergovernmental organizations. So, okay, next slide. So without further ado, I am excited to share that as of last year, we did make a firm commitment to make a 30% reduction in emissions by 2030 with our manufacturing partners, so tier 1 and tier 2. And so tier 1 and tier 2 is the initial factory scope. All of the factories that have completed the Hague FEM, because that's our key environmental assessment tool that our factories complete annually. And it's our primary source of environmental performance data. And this year we've tied Hague FEM verification requirements to the factory's emissions output. So if a factory is a very high emitter, not a big plan, we are requiring verification as a means to be able to track progress and set that kind of baseline. And the strategy leverages, go back. Almost done with that one. These are intensity targets. So they're intensity targets and they're based on a 2019 baseline. And one thing I will share before we go to the next slide is that we did check with our suppliers prior to rolling this out. We did a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of discussions with them, and we sent a survey to them in early September of last year. And actually a little over 77% of our supply chain actually let us know that they're already doing this work to measure and reduce emissions impact. And so I just wanted to frame that because I think a lot of times brands are looked at to push their factories to do this work. But in reality, when we've discussed this with factories, many of them have already started this work. And there's a big personal interest in it versus, just brands saying you have to do this. So I just wanted to frame that we really see this as a partnership, and our factories are doing quite a lot of work already. So next slide. So with that, Columbia's supply chain is huge. We have, over 250 factories that we work with at the tier 1 and tier 2 level. And so it's really important to think about how we actually prioritize working with factories. Some factories are already far along in this process. Some factories haven't even started. And so we really wanted to make sure that we looked at all of our factories and come up with segmentation criteria to really calculate a factory's climate opportunity criteria, which is like their opportunity for improvement. So this is at the facility level. So I just wanted to share, 3 different criteria that we look at to really determine how much engagement and support will we need to put forward with these factories, and how high should these climate targets be set for certain facilities. So we look at their factory emissions intensity, we look at their Higg FEM energy score, which really is how we view readiness, and then total emissions. And so our business volume is integrated into this criteria because obviously the more business we have at the factory, the higher the emissions. So with that, next slide. And that segmentation criteria that I mentioned is very important because we wanted to tie a lot of our different programs and initiatives to it. And so when we think about factory training, capability building, supporting our factories, we really looked at the factories with the highest emissions in order to determine things like, Higg FEM verification requirements, but also whether we want to nominate them for great programs like Clean by Design, for example. So I wanted to just share a little bit here. There is a link to a case study, which you can view later, but I did want to just share like the Climate Action Corps members. I know Clean by Design is a program that we're pushing a lot. I'm happy to talk to anybody after about it, but I did want to say that this is a really critical program that we're looking to scale up as a means and pull best practices from as a means to talk to our factories about what kind of reduction investments they need to make in order to decarbonize their workplace. So next and last slide. And what those reduction investments look like, I just want to share, like Clean by Design is grounded in these 10 best practices that were created by the National Resources Defense Council, Linda Greer, and a lot of her work with the Apparel Impact Institute. So I want to say with Clean by Design, when factories go through this program, they're kind of reviewed across these 10 different best practices. It gets really technical. It's not the sexiest thing to talk about, but I will say like this is really important in reducing those emissions. And it gives a factory a blueprint to understand what actions to take, how much it'll cost, and what the payback period is. And so we really are working to integrate this into our core program. And I'm happy to talk more with anybody that's interested in exploring this as well. Okay, next slide. So my last one. So this is just my information. If you want to talk further about this, I know we shared a lot of information. Happy to talk further. So thanks. Back to you, Michael.
Awesome, Joleen, that was fantastic. A couple things. Joleen, you mentioned just the importance of asking suppliers where they're at and getting them engaged. So important. I think too often we maybe overlook that suppliers, manufacturers may be doing this work already, and frankly, they're a critical component. So we'll come back to that in Q&A. And then I am noting the questions coming in. There are some great ones. So I'm making a note and we'll come back to them at the end. So with that, I'm gonna invite Steve to flip on his camera and talk about how chemistry and chemicals management can actually help reduce impact. So Steve, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Richardson, and I'm Archroma's Brand Solutions Manager for the West Coast of the US. Archroma is a global textile chemical company. We have over 3,000 employees. We're headquartered in Switzerland, and we have 26 global manufacturing sites, including one here in Martin, South Carolina in the US. So we're a very big company with a lot of impact. We make all different types of dyes, finishing chemistry, auxiliaries, and other chemicals for the supply chain, as well as a color management system that I will mention shortly. Our approach to sustainable textile chemistry is called the Archroma way. And it's a systems-based approach where we look for ways to combine different chemical products in order to maximize sustainability in processing. So we call it optimized processing, and it's a way to really find new impacts. A lot of brands so far have focused on choosing sustainable fibers, and I think Rachel did a great job speaking to that and that work at prAna. And I feel like the next step in our industry is really to look at the impact reductions that can take place because of better chemistry use. And I'm going to talk now about a few ways that brands can do that. So our sustainable systems for dyeing are split up into different technologies. And this pyramid the base of the pyramid is more scalable technologies, such as dispersed dye systems that we call fast sport, or acid dye systems for nylon and wool, indigo dyeing systems, and reactive dyeing systems for cotton products. So all those are very high volume, scalable technologies, and have very solid sustainability attributes. As you go up the pyramid, we go to more, I guess, not as common dyeing technologies that might have even more sustainable attributes. And at the very top of the pyramid is our earth colors technology, which are sulfur dyes that are made from plant waste. So they even have lower environmental impacts than natural dyes that are made from botanical plants. These systems can be accessed by brands through their choice of color palette. And Archroma has a color management system called the Color Atlas that incorporates both physical libraries, online tools for both color palette creation, palette management, and lab dip approval that can actually enable almost a fully digital or virtual lab dip approval process. And then we have color standards and design tools that can be used by designers at brands or labs at suppliers for color approval. Okay, next slide, Michael. The online version of the Color Atlas has direct links to Archroma's sustainable dye system. So here you see a reference to Swift blends, and I'll come back to that later, but it's a system for dyeing polyester cotton blends with reduced impacts. By choosing a color that is part of that where the recipe is part of that Swift blend system, you can start to make those impact reductions at the palette creation stage. Then you can also check the recipe to see if that shade has eco-label certifications such as Blue Sign approved, Okotex compliant, and ZDHC MRSL conforming. So the Color Atlas is a very useful tool in the palette creation in order to enable these sustainable choices from the very beginning. It can also reduce the impacts of the lab dip process by reducing the amount of shipping required and reducing the time and the number of dips required to achieve your color targets. And to promote this, we are currently offering a 30% promotion, 30% off promotion on the Color Atlas library through Earth Day of this year. And if anybody wants to know more about that, please contact me. Once a brand has identified or a manufacturer has chosen a sustainable dyeing system, for instance, the Swift blend system, Archroma's created a process simulator called our one-way tool, and it can show the resources used in the current system. So this is an example of the current process for dyeing a polyester cotton blend, where we see there are 12 dye baths used to dye 10,000 meters of fabric. There are over 29,000 liters of water used. Over 5,000 megajoules of energy are consumed, generating 324 kilograms of CO2. And this process simulator can track and calculate all that data, including cost and production time savings. Then when we look at the new system, go ahead, Michael. When we look at the new optimized system, we see that there's the opportunity just by changing to the Archroma Swift Blend system recipe to reduce the number of dye baths in half, to cut the water consumption by half, the energy consumption by more than 50%, and to get a significant reduction in CO2 generated, cost, and production lead time. So this one-way calculator can really help brands to quantify both their resources used, the resource savings from switching to an optimized process and more sustainable chemistry, and the efficiencies gained could even result in reduced lead times and reduced cost of production. This tool is also available as the BlueSign Blue Expert tool. The one-way tool is kind of the foundation for the BlueSign Blue Expert tool. And so that's another way to tap into quantifying those resource savings that are available from sustainable chemistry. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Awesome. Steve, thank you so much. And I'm just reminding folks that I am seeing some amazing questions come in. So we are going to get to those live. We'll have some time at the end. So keep them coming. So last but not least, we'll have Jenn Swain from Burton talk about their work on material manufacturing. So Jenn, over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm Jenn Swain, the Director of Global Sustainability at Burton Snowboards, and I also sit on the Sustainability Advisory Council of the Outdoor Industry Association. For us, we really see that partnership with peers and competitors around issues like climate change are particularly compelling because they demonstrate really the importance of community well-being and interdependence over an individual pursuit of profit. So Burton's a founding member of the Climate Action Corps, which is catalyzing bold action to reduce emissions and address really system-level change in our shared supply chains and beyond. We also partner really actively with the broader business community, including fellow certified B corporations. So we look forward to partnering more closely within the outdoor industry on specific carbon reduction efforts going forward. Today, I'm really going to focus on just one part of Burton's climate strategy and briefly share how Burton has made measurable carbon reduction in one of our many product categories and the most important category for us, which is snowboards. Next, Michael. So Burton is a global brand, a manufacturer, and a retailer. And while our own company operations do lead to greenhouse gas emissions, the bulk of our carbon footprint really occurs within the supply chain. So I want to clarify up front that when I'm talking about greenhouse gas emissions on the whole, I might refer to it as carbon emissions or our carbon footprint, and I'm really referring to carbon dioxide equivalents, really just putting greenhouse gas emissions into a common measurement. Product manufacturing, as you see here, accounts for about 75% of Burton's overall carbon footprint as a company. And we've focused most of our efforts on measurable reduction in hard goods manufacturing over the past 8 years. So the diagram that you see on the right shows kind of a image of life cycle assessment. So since 2013, Burton's used life cycle assessment, or LCA, to measure the environmental impacts of our hard goods. We measure from cradle to gate. So that means essentially from the extraction of natural resources through to the manufacturing of the finished product. And we identify high impact areas and then work to reduce those impacts by improving product design, material choices, manufacturing processes, and energy sources. And we really focus on the manufacturing phase, which you see kind of in orange, because this is where we have the greatest control over our carbon emissions. However, although we're not using LCA to measure the rest of the life cycle, we do additionally address other parts of the life cycle like transportation, distribution, and use phase through different measurement approaches. Next, Michael. So what you see here is an example carbon footprint for our winter 2017 custom snowboard model. So Burton's sustainability efforts are made possible by the hard work of passionate employees throughout the company and around the world. And our engineering and product development teams, as I mentioned, have been using LCA software in-house since 2013. So when we were setting our 2020 sustainability goals, which we just wrapped up a couple of months ago, we were using the winter 2017 product season to set our baseline. We use two considerations on how we kind of map our progress and what we're really focusing on for reduction. And one is, what are the areas of greatest emissions? So what are the biggest pieces of the pie? And where do we really have the greatest control, or where can we really feasibly make change? Next slide. So in December of 2017, we announced ambitious sustainability goals really across our company in order to achieve on a 3-year time frame. And for hard goods, this included a 20% average carbon footprint reduction per unit, cradle to gate. So next, we've exceeded our 2020 carbon reduction goal. So we've actually reduced the average carbon footprint of our snowboards by 21%, which is really exciting. And I'll show you on the next slide just a few ways that we've approached this. These are just 4 examples. It's not everything that we've done, but from the standpoint of product design. So we eliminated the use of lacquer as a top coat. And this, both was a carbon reduction, but also a reduction in harmful or toxic chemicals. For material selection, we've used super sap epoxy for a long time, and it's a plant-based epoxy, and it has a carbon footprint that's about a third lower than conventional petroleum-based epoxies. In terms of manufacturing practices or processes, we've reduced waste by really focusing on engineering changes to how we're making our wooden snowboard cores. And then energy sources have been really key. So we always want to make sure that we are making innovative, high performance, durable, high quality products. And so we really do also need to focus not just on the changes to the products and manufacturing, but also to the facilities themselves and the energy that's powering them. So in 2019, 2 of our key snowboard partners, one in Shanghai and one in Taiwan, installed on-site solar directly as a result of Burton's carbon reduction goals and partnering toward this change. And one of them is getting about 25% of their power from solar, and the other about 70%. So that's been a really key part of our relationship. And we look forward, as we kind of set our next targets, aligned with science, of course, to work with those throughout the outdoor industry to really tackle our shared supply chains. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, everyone. So before we get to Q&A, I just want to flag that for the Climate Action Corps, members have committed to measure their Scope 3 emissions. So all of the companies you've heard from are in the process or have already measured their Scope 3 emissions. The core guidebook is a really valuable resource that gives guidance, tips, and tools to help companies get started. And the OIA is also developing collabs, or collective impact projects, where we're trying to bundle together similar product types to work in the supply chain to reduce emissions. And so if you're interested in joining these collabs, there's an email address on this slide, and you can see the possible categories of products on the right-hand side. So please reach out and let us know if you would like to be part of this. And with that, I'm going to ask the participants to flip on their cameras, and I'm going to field some of these questions. And so we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. We got a few questions about design, and I mean, Rachel, you can speak to this. I mean, actually, I think quite a few of you can speak to this, but Rachel, there's a specific question around the criteria that prAna uses for biodiversity in new materials. Are there any frameworks that you find helpful? And then maybe a second part of that is, where can designers start when trying to establish criteria and standards for material selection? So kind of 2 parts. So maybe Rachel, you can start, and then if others want to chime in, please do.
That's perfect. So biodiversity, and where do you start with material selection to lean into preferred fibers? So we have always relied really heavily on the industry tools that are accessible to us. Again, we are a small team, there are 2 of us. So it's really important that we not only have industry tools that we can access, but that we also empower our team members to help us with the research and development on new and innovation, and to identify what's right for our brand. We took a really strong stance as a brand that overall reduction is the first thing that we try to do. And then the second thing is to reuse what we already have. So those 2 foundations set the stage for how we built our preferred fibers list. A brand with a different point of view, their preferred fibers list might look different. I can't speak to that, but I would think that there would be some diversity in that. So we are always looking for how do we reduce first, and then how do we reuse second. So recycled is a term that keeps popping up a lot, or regenerated on our fiber list. As far as biodiversity, that is something that was almost inherent up until now by going through our preferred fibers list. And it's something that, using the program through Textile Exchange, we're looking at how do we actually make that an official process. It's something we talk about, it is something that we don't have a standard SOP for biodiversity yet, but it is something that I feel like by the end of 21, we will have. So as a designer, I would say you utilize the Textile Exchange information, you utilize HIG, MSI to look at those LCAs that are available, and you ask a lot of questions.
Yeah, awesome. Any other thoughts? And Jen, I'm not sure if you have thoughts on this, but there's a question around good resources for sustainable and recycled materials for technical equipment. And I suppose that could include hard goods like snowboards and skis, but then maybe there's some other types of technical equipment. So any guidance for how to find better materials for snowboards and other hard goods from anyone on the line?
I don't have a strong resource from a sourcing perspective, but I will share that we collaborate with groups around the world as a global company, and I know that the European outdoor group currently is running some pilots very specifically around hard goods materials and recyclable materials for hard goods. So they would be a great resource to reach out for.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Yeah, I would also add, Joleen had mentioned that a lot of Columbia's suppliers had already started doing a lot of this work. And I just encourage brands on the call to ask. We have, sort of initial vendor screening at NEMO that time and again has shown us that a lot of vendors, tier 1 and tier 2 and beyond, are already doing a lot of great work. And they may not be forthcoming about it, but just asking the right questions, there's great opportunities to collaborate.
Yeah. Theresa, on that point, how did you get your manufacturing partners engaged in this and excited to work with you on this? I would imagine they have lots of other things that they're juggling. And I think this is a question for any brand that wants to engage manufacturers. Like, how do you get them on board and prioritizing this work?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that we're for-profit businesses, and we live in a capitalist society. And for Chipper in particular, the factory that we worked with on Switchback, it was not an easy process. Sort of in the image, there was sort of the nesting, like sort of geography and geodes of that. It took a lot of design work with the supplier to be able to pull off that pad in the first place, but then it was hugely successful. So we, of course, and I think that suppliers and humans and people, we want to do the right thing, and they recognize that they weren't excited about the waste they had. But then when you put the carrot of, we have a product that we think could be really successful, that was a big driver. So kind of a combination of, I think a lot of brands in the outdoor industry work pretty closely with vendors, especially in hard goods. I think that inherently there's just a lot of design development work there, and using sort of a carrot of success works.
Yeah, and that's great. Steve, with chemistry, at least in my understanding, oftentimes investments in better chemistry and better processes absolutely pay off. You may just have to take a life cycle view or a life cycle costing view of those investments. How do you navigate that with some of the brands you work with that are wanting to reduce emissions? And for the audience, generally textile dyeing, I don't know, Steve, you may have data on this, but it can be like 20, 30% of total, emissions from all the heating of water. So Steve, how do you get companies comfortable with the investment needed up front? Because it absolutely pays back.
True, and I think a lot of that is happening in the supply chain. The one-way tool that I showed was created to encourage textile mills to adopt better chemistry, not necessarily just for sustainability reasons, but because they can reduce their costs. And as water becomes more expensive globally, that's going to become much more of an issue in our industry. I would say that if brands are aware of that, they can share in those efficiencies, including cost reductions and reductions in environmental impact. But they're already starting to happen within the supply chain. So, and I think, a few people have said it, but the most important thing we can do is to ask those questions up the supply chain and start to find out where those opportunities might be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great. Theresa, you got a very specific question about whether NEMO is looking to expand the reclaimed foam into other products. I'll let you answer that, but I'm also curious to hear more about the unexpected performance benefits that you found. And I've heard that anecdote for other types of products. So, would love to hear more about that. And then for others on the line, are you also seeing unintended, unexpected performance benefits to these sustainability initiatives?
Sure.
Maybe
So,
Theresa,
the answer is absolutely yes. We're considering, could we make like a switchback with only reclaimed foam? There is plenty of foam stock, sort of the imagery of just one day of production from this factory speaks volumes. But, this is one very small supplier in a very large industry. So I think that there's a lot of innovation to be had there. And it's something we're absolutely looking into. And we did have some unexpected wins with Chipper. And it's interesting because the way that you use a sleeping pad versus a sitting pad is a little different. And it was a happy accident that the formulation of it's the same type of foam, but just different density levels, and just the kind of marbled way that those different densities of the same type of foam came together. It's just really comfy to sit on. But we're absolutely looking at putting it into more, and also very much so thinking, how can we take this case study to our other factories and to our other product lines?
Great. Joleen, curious if you could speak to how Columbia is working with other brands that may be buying from the same facilities that you are. How does that happen? What's your experience? What are some of the challenges with that?
Yeah, we're actually working on a pilot project right now. So with Peril Impact Institute and Reset Carbon, called the Carbon Leadership Project. So it's a big brand collaboration set up where we're working on a clean by design program with select facilities, but it's enhanced with a carbon management aspect to it, so that the factories learn about carbon management as well as energy, because I think it's not always so clear for factories sometimes to figure out, when you collect the energy data, how does that convert to carbon? So we did that with our factories that are on our higher priority list, like in terms of our segmentation. But the way in which that AII and Reset Carbon is convening brands is that they're looking at all different aspects of decarbonization, from renewable energy to coming up with a joint technical guidebook, looking at processes and machinery, for example, and then thinking about just kind of surveying brands and figuring out like who is interested in pursuing this work. Let's look at our factory list and see who we share, who can we pilot this with. So kind of coming at it from that angle, because I think that's something that for factories, a lot of them have been down this road a lot with a lot of factory requirements, a lot of redundant factory requirements. And so this is a really good concerted effort to streamline brand requests so that factories can really have the time to focus on improvement versus like meet Columbia's requirements or prAna's requirements or this and that. Not that we would be, because we're in the same family, but like just some factories that are kind of grappling with a lot of brand requests out there. And it's in our best interest to streamline it from the brand level.
Awesome. Great.
And I did want to just mention one thing that what Theresa was saying about manufacturer engagement. It is so important to, as you think through requirements for your factory, to really think about engaging with them in the development of it, because I think too often you see a lot of well-intentioned brands kind of come up with requirements and programs and policies and kind of throw it over the wall into the factories, be like, meet this, or maybe we'll stop sourcing from you. But a lot of factories actually have a lot of knowledge in this area, and we we're able to pull in so much knowledge and expertise around this cancer program to really make sure that what we put forth is achievable and accommodating of what factories have already done. So just can't emphasize that enough. Please talk to your factories and get their feedback about things before you kind of put requirements on them.
Yeah, amazing. Yep, that's a great maybe last comment. And I mean, maybe just, you know, literally 20 seconds from each individual on the panel. You know, if you were just starting today in trying to reduce your supply chain emissions, where would you start? What would you do first?
I know no one likes to go first, but I'll jump in. It's okay. Honestly, I don't know that I would do anything different than what we're doing already. Knowing that the material processing and that is where the bulk of it lives, I think that that's where I would still start. It makes the most sense. Yeah. It's using the most resources as well. So I think there's like a double win when you reduce that. So for me, I think that I would start exactly where we are. Yeah. Maybe have more metrics behind it, but not just go with gut.
Yeah, and sorry, Joleen. Sort of backing up what Rachel was saying, you know, once you've identified, okay, materials is where I want to be, using resources like sort of the OIA one-pagers, the Higg Index, the Higg MSI is super valuable. We actually use the Higg MSI to figure out some of that data that I shared on Chipper. And also the Textile Exchange has really great sort of ways for you to compare and contrast materials and make decisions in your sourcing.
Yeah, awesome.
To that point, as others have mentioned during this call, I think it's really important that while we're talking about climate, we don't lose sight of other impacts, right? And so a lot of these tools that have been mentioned, particularly on the textile side, additionally provide information about impacts to biodiversity, water consumption, et cetera. So just keep that in mind, kind of the complexity of the decisions you're making and how many different targets you might be putting in place to make sure that you're not having unintentional negative impacts along the way as well.
Yeah, great.
I would say that the key thing for most brands is to understand your supply chains and the products you're making. You know, and that is an ongoing effort. You know, every time you make a new product or change suppliers, you've got to go through that whole process again. And I think we're seeing that more and more, that there's that need to really understand the full supply chain from tier 1 all the way through to tier 4 for your materials, because that way, then you can start to ask those important questions and start to make decisions about how to reduce those impacts.
Yep, great. Awesome. Okay, I think that was everyone. And with that, I'll just remind folks that if you're interested in getting involved in a collab to address these issues that folks are talking about, please pop a note to this email address, and really appreciate the time and insights from the panelists. I learned a ton, and hopefully everyone on the call did as well. And really appreciate you joining. So thank you so much.